For more on the political reaction to the deadly shooting, let's bring in Scott MacFarlane and Tyler Pager. Scott is CBS News congressional correspondent, and Tyler is White House reporter for The Washington Post. Thank you both so much for being here. A lot to get to. So just back from his trip from Asia, President Biden addressed the Texas mass shooting last night, but he had this to say this afternoon.
The idea that an 18-year-old can walk into a store and buy weapons of war designed and marketed to kill is, I think, just wrong. It just violates common sense. Even the manufacturer, the inventor of that weapon, thought that as well.
So, Tyler, can you walk us through the president's executive action on police reform that he signed into law this afternoon?
Yeah, so these comments that we just heard were at this event marked to the 2-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd when he was in police custody in Minneapolis. And so the efforts today that the president signed are related to trying to improve police accountability, creating a national database of officers fired for misconduct, and trying to incentivize police officers from not using no-knock warrants and chokeholds. And so that was the focus of the event today, but obviously overshadowed by the tragedy yesterday in Texas. And the other piece of news we heard from the president today is that he's planning to travel to Texas to visit with the families and victims and survivors of the shooting in Texas.
Another visit by the president to the scene of a mass shooting. Back over to Capitol Hill, Scott, senators on both sides of the aisle have addressed this most recent shooting today. Let's listen to what Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia had to say.
We have to reach across the bench, but we can't politicize it. It has to be done in such a practical way. It just makes sense. We have Democrats and Republicans who have had different ideas and good legislation. I've been working on Manchin Toomey for many, many years. But there's other senators, too, on the Republican side that had some ideas that we could all incorporate into one good, holistic type of piece of legislation.
I can't assure the American people there's any law we can pass to stop this shooting. This man had no criminal record. He shot his grandmother in the face. He lawfully purchased a gun.
This is a question of not what is going to happen in the Senate. I can tell you what's going to happen in the Senate because I've seen it before. It's the most distorted Groundhog Day that I've ever seen. This is just going to be the same thing as it was after Parkland, after Newtown. Here, nothing is changing.
So, Scott, even if Congress was able to get any sort of consensus on actual legislation, they're heading out to recess in a couple of days. So what would be the timeline to actually debate and vote on something?
Yeah, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Dick Durbin, told me they're not going to be able to take up a debate or a vote until after the Memorial Day recess. And the U.S. Senate doesn't take a recess for Memorial Day like we do. It's not a 3-day weekend. They're out until the second week of June. So that's the realistic timetable. And those who watch the Senate closely recognize that's a reasonable logistical timetable for the U.S. Senate. But it may not be a palatable timetable for those who are yearning and advocating for gun control reform. Senator Chris Murphy, perhaps the most vocal proponent of gun control reform today. He, of course, is from Connecticut and represented the House district previously where there is Sandy Hook. He said, too, that they'll try to negotiate next week, but likely won't be able to take this up until after the Memorial Day recess. And that begs the question, Caitlin, does this effort, this renewed discussion about gun control and new legislation lose momentum with time, where every second and every minute is crucial when you're trying to move an intransigent U.S. Senate, when they're trying to get 60 votes where 60 votes do not currently exist?
Yeah, the biggest impediment to legislation is time, as we both know well from covering these issues. I mean, Scott, we saw you in that video with Cory Booker. Just quickly, does anything feel different on Capitol Hill? You've covered this time and time again. Is anything from your conversations with lawmakers, from being up there, does anything feel different this time around?
No, doesn't feel different than the days after the tragedy in Buffalo. Doesn't feel different than the days and weeks after the dual tragedies in El Paso and Dayton. It's very symmetrical. We were staked out outside the Senate Judiciary Committee, and this line of Democratic senators, one at a time, appeared before the reporters and spent quite a bit of time with us. It was a little more difficult to pursue Republican voices today. They were not as willing to come meet with us. But there's also the symmetry, Caitlin, in the responses. The same messaging we've heard after previous tragedies. The Democrats calling for either end to the filibuster so that majority will rule and they can get their legislation passed with Democratic votes only, or messaging bills, calling for messaging bills to be on the floor so both parties are forced to take a position, much like they did with the messaging bill on abortion earlier this month. For Republicans, we heard a number calling for hardening of schools with the potential for more armed police officers in schools or more firm infrastructural changes in school buildings with more cameras, locks, and things like that. This is all falling into the pattern we've seen after previous shootings, of which there have been far too many.
Exactly. I mean, speaking of one of those shootings, we have fresh CBS polling on this issue because there was just recently that mass shooting in Buffalo. And that polling shown after that shooting that was taken then, but obviously before this violence in Texas, shows such a sharp partisan split. Take a look at the screen. 79% of Democrats want stricter regulations on gun sales compared to 27% of Republicans. And some 49% of Republicans say that they want things to stay as is. So, Tyler, from your perspective covering this White House, when they look at numbers like this, how do they ever create any sort of real change?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that this president has seen throughout his political career. He is someone that has been deeply engaged in trying to prevent gun violence since he was a senator, being a big advocate of the assault weapons ban, and then when he was vice president, being tapped by then President Obama to lead the response to Sandy Hook and draft the executive orders President Obama then signed and really be deeply involved in the process of trying to pass that Manchin Toomey bill that we heard Senator Joe Manchin talk about, which really centered on trying to bolster background checks for guns. I think when you talk to the White House, they point to polling that shows, and even in the CBS poll that we just saw, that the combination of Democrats and independents, there's an overwhelming number of American people who want to see stricter reforms when it comes to gun control. But I think the larger problem here is the breakdown of the U.S. Senate. There is no path at this moment to 60 votes required to break the filibuster and pass some sort of gun control legislation. And I think the president is well aware of that. After the Buffalo shooting just over a week ago, he was asked by reporters what else he could do from the Oval Office. And he said, look, there's not much more I can do from the executive branch, that he's already done 4 tranches of executive orders around crime and gun violence prevention efforts. When you talk to advocates, they disagree. They say there is more that can be done, but the president conceded that most of the substantive work that can be done in trying to prevent more shootings like this rests in Congress's hands. So I think we'll continue to see him pressure the Senate, try to get something up for a vote even at this point, but it's unlikely given the political dynamics in the Senate. As Scott just outlined, it's going to be a real uphill battle for anything substantive to come out of that body.
Yeah, and Tyler, that's a really good point, because sadly this is not new. I mean, presidents have been forced to address school shootings for over a generation. Take a listen to this.
And we're going to have to come together and take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics.
Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun.
Laura and I and many across our nation are praying for the victims and their families and all the members of the university community who have been devastated by this terrible tragedy.
To the people of the community of Littleton, I can only say tonight that the prayers of the American people are with you.
So, Tyler, as you alluded to, I mean, this is a president who served as vice president to Obama. He went through this with Sandy Hook. You know, he knows, of course, that Congress is unlikely to act. Do we have any indication of what he might be able to actually do, or is this something that becomes sort of a midterm election issue for November?
I mean, I think we heard that today from Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, saying, the best way for Americans to voice their opinions is through the ballot box in November with these midterm elections and all the seats that are up for grabs. I think that is the reality that most people inside this White House know. When I've spoken with my sources at the White House today, they acknowledge the sadness and the tragedy that has overcome the entire building, the president on down. But they also recognize that the most substantive change, as I said earlier, is through the Senate. The House passed a bill on background checks, but even Senator Schumer recognizing that it is unlikely to get any significant support from Republicans, and barring that, there's no way it ends up on the president's desk. So I think there's going to be, I'm sure, policy processes to try to see what other sort of executive actions the president could take, but ultimately that is not going to be at the level that a lot of people want to see, just given the power that the president has or lack thereof.
And Scott, kind of on that note, I mean, when you talk to Republicans, they talk a lot about the solution being the, sort of hardening out or hardening of schools. Can you kind of walk us through what some of this means? What are they talking about here when they use that term?
Well, there's two different facets to that, Caitlin. There can be the increasing of armed security officers, or what they call SROs, school resource officers, or the simple building upgrades, those vestibules that those of us who have kids know we have to enter to get into a school building, electronically locked doors, digital radios, camera systems, the latter of which the Justice Department's been spending an awful lot of money on. Using the Freedom of Information Act, we pulled Justice Department records and found they have significantly increased spending on school hardening since 2018. By our count, more than $150 million for school districts big and small, from Atlantic City, New Jersey, to Logan County, West Virginia. And they spend this money on the things you'd expect: cameras, security, entrances, active shooter training, mental health training programs. So the hardening has been happening, and it's been increasing by an order of magnitude. So to say we need to harden buildings, that's not happening in a vacuum. There's quite a bit of hardening going on already.
Yeah, and I mean, we know inside the Beltway that a lot of people know that Congress is unlikely to act. There's little the president can actually do. But outside Washington, you have a lot of people very frustrated at that fact and wondering why something cannot get done on this issue time and time again. But Scott MacFarlane, Tyler Pager, thank you both for breaking it down from Capitol Hill to the White House. Thanks so much for your reporting, as always.